The month of November is almost done, and the question now is, what is December going to bring to Bitcoin as well as altcoins, and are we ever going to see this altcoin season? We're going to take a look at the big catalyst for December, my thoughts as to what's going to happen. So if you are new to the channel, make sure you subscribe, hit the like button, and let's talk about what December is going to bring to crypto. First and foremost, let's talk about how Q4 has been absolutely horrible for Bitcoin, altcoins, Ethereum. The whole market has gone down in Q4, and historically speaking, Q4 is the better quarter for Bitcoin, altcoins, and we usually see that massive euphoria happen in Q4. Now, taking a look at what we've seen in 2025, Q4 has actually been the worst performing quarter of 2025. If we go back to Q3, it was about a modest 6%. Q2, very bullish, 29%, almost 30% on Bitcoin. Q1, 12%. But if you take a look at the Q4 column, we would now be in the second worst Q4 of Bitcoin's history, which is quite crazy to think because we've made new all-time highs on Bitcoin just at the beginning of Q4, and now we're down at 20 or so percent on Bitcoin. So the question is, what's going to happen next? Well, first and foremost, we need to look at the price of Bitcoin because at the time of me recording this, Bitcoin has made a bit of a rally. As we said in our Discord and in previous videos, this was absolutely expected. I mean, after a whopping, let's say, 5 weeks of Bitcoin going down from $126,000 all the way to a low of roughly 80,500, being down 36% in the matter of 5 weeks, there was no doubt going to be a relief rally. But the question remains is whether or not the catalysts in December are going to be able to push Bitcoin higher, back above the 50-week moving average, and back onwards into this bull market euphoric stage that we are still waiting for. So as we end November and we get closer to December, that's exactly what I'm looking for. We did hit support on that 100-week moving average, which is good, but we are still below that 50-week moving average, which has held support for Bitcoin over the course of the last 2.5 years. Again, looking at that blue line, you've seen that ever since, the end of 2022, beginning of 2023, we've crossed above it and we haven't been below it or haven't closed below the 50-week moving average since that time up until the last few weeks. Now we're at the 100-week moving average. Found support there. The question I believe is going to be next is, as I said, I do believe Bitcoin's going back to that 50-week moving average, but the question is going to be whether it breaks above it, comes back and goes up even higher into 2026, or it hits that 50-week moving average and bounces back lower. Some great arrows there on TradingView, but that is my current thought on Bitcoin. But again, we do have many catalysts coming up for December. And if you want to stay up to date with crypto, with my thoughts, well, we have all of that in our Discord. It's the first link in the description below. Just a few days ago, I was talking about, we're likely going to continue seeing a rally into December, talking about some of the catalysts coming up, and then talking about some of the large caps that I'd be looking at and kind of, giving you guys invalidation criteria so that if you do get into altcoins at this time, it's a great time to catch the bounce. But on the flip side, if things were to come back, you should not be holding the bag for absolutely ever. Now, with that out of the way, catalyst number one is going to be the Fed ending quantitative tightening. Now, this is extremely important, and I can't emphasize it enough because quantitative tightening has been ongoing since April/May of 2022. And every other altcoin season that we had, in the past, in previous cycles, were not during quantitative tightening. They were actually in quantitative easing or a balance in the federal balance sheet. So let me show you exactly what I mean by this. If we take a look at the Fed balance sheet, this basically shows you whether or not the Fed is doing quantitative tightening, which means they are selling treasury assets. And to see this visually on the graph, basically, as this line goes down, this is quantitative tightening. And as I said, this started in May of 2022. After COVID pandemic, they just started selling some treasury assets and quantitative tightening started back then. So it's been about 3+ years of quantitative tightening. And as we know, we've never seen, an altcoin season or typical euphoric peaks during quantitative tightening. If we go back to 2021, well, 2021, obviously Bitcoin moon, altcoins went crazy and the Fed was printing money like there's no tomorrow. Quantitative easing going from, a balance sheet of roughly $4 million in 2019 to a top of $8.9 billion, which is just absolutely crazy. And as we can see in 2017, it wasn't quantitative tightening, it wasn't quantitative easing. The Fed was just maintaining the balance sheet, which is likely what's going to happen in 2026 or in December when they really end quantitative tightening. I do see the Fed balance sheet kind of just flatlining before starting quantitative easing yet again, printing more money, adding liquidity to the markets, which could be a very real scenario in 2026. So that is catalyst number one. That is happening on Monday, which quite literally is in just a few days. It's US Thanksgiving as you're watching this, so the markets are closed. But if you really think of it, in 2 market days, we're going to have the end of quantitative tightening. There's likely going to be some bullish momentum to the price of crypto and, of course, stocks. Now, if we take a look at catalyst number 2, catalyst number 2 has to do with the FOMC meeting. The FOMC meeting is where the Fed is going to say, listen, we're going to cut rates or we're going to hold rates or we're going to increase rates. They're obviously not increasing the interest rates at this point in time. Taking a look at the current odds for these interest rate cuts come December 10th, we have an 85% chance of the Fed cutting by 0.25 points. So over the month of November, there has been pure volatility in what the Fed was going to do in December. The US government shutdown did absolutely not help this condition because we were missing, or, I say we, but the Fed was missing a whole lot of data to make an informed decision coming into that December 10th meeting. There's been a bit of economic data ever since the US government's back in action. But as we can see right now, the odds are in favor of a cut. And I do think, of course, the Fed is going to cut by 0.25 come the December meeting. And that, again, is bullish for the markets. Now, that's likely already priced in as it's now been a few days since these odds have dramatically changed in favor of a cut. So it may not just, pump the markets on December 10th. But could you imagine if the Fed would hold rates, or in, the other sense, the Fed increases the rates? Well, that would be absolute chaos in the markets. I don't think they're going to be doing that. So, of course, them reducing rates is still a bullish thing, which is going to maintain that bullish outlook for 2026. So we had Catalyst 1, Catalyst 2, Catalyst 3. If you take a look at the Fear and Greed Index, right now, nobody cares about crypto. It's quite evident. You go on any YouTube channel, you go on any social metrics, everything's down, nobody cares, and honestly, it feels like the absolute end in crypto, especially over the last few weeks. Now, it's important to remain cautious, but it's also important to understand what's happening in the macroeconomics, because macro is going to help you understand if there is still some bullishness left or if it's all doom and gloom. And because we have a few catalysts coming up, we can still be bullish until we really see more definitive data that this market is not going to turn around. So if you look at the Fear and Greed Index, we have been in the gutter over the last few, days, even over the last week. we've been in extreme fear. And this reminds me very much so of April and March when we were in the extreme fear. Bitcoin and the markets rallied quite significantly after this, which is good. And right now we are seeing a bit of a rally in terms of the sentiment as Bitcoin has made its way around 91,000 at the time of me recording this video. But again, I want you guys to understand that this is a bounce that, everybody was calling for. It makes sense. Bitcoin was down 36% in Q4 over the last 5 weeks. And again, looking at the chart, in my opinion, you still have a ways to go for Bitcoin to really get back into this massive bull market, which we are all, waiting for that euphoric stage. And again, better liquidity conditions may only be what we need for that to happen. And that is coming up relatively soon. Now, going back to the interest rates, I wanted to highlight something else as well, because we looked at December meeting, but if you look at meetings after December into 2026, you can see that by mid-2026, we are seeing that probabilities are sitting around 34% chance of having a 3 to 3.25 interest rate, which is right now about 0.75 to a full basis point lower than where we currently are. So that means that interest rates are likely going to be continuing to be cut in 2026, which is only going to emphasize the bullishness of liquidity conditions in 2026. So again, the cascading event of liquidity in 2026 is looking promising, but the same question remains is whether or not that's going to suffice for Bitcoin and altcoins to really rally into 2026. Now, another thing I wanted to mention, which is quite interesting, is what JP Morgan has recently said on Twitter. So if we take a look at this, this is JP Morgan's estimate or prediction as to what could happen to the S&P 500, which is, the top 500 companies in the state that make up this index. They say that it could reach $8,000 in 2026. Right now, the S&P is sitting around 6,800, which means that in 2026, JP Morgan is forecasting or seeing the possibility of a massive gain on the S&P 500 because of easing conditions by the Fed. So again, quantitative tightening ending, and of course, interest rates getting lower. So that is a major, piece of information. In my opinion, it kind of goes to show JP Morgan, one of the top banks out there, is predicting for a bullish 2026. And again, that is going to be left to be seen. So I do think it's absolutely worth monitoring what happens next in December following those catalysts that we are getting. So with that being said, that is what's happening in the economy, as well as more focused on Bitcoin. But if we quickly switch gears and take a look at altcoins, because we're still all holding altcoins, we're still all waiting for that altcoin season, myself included, I'm still in the same boat. I've been trading here and there despite the market conditions. We've been able to spot other narratives and so on and so forth. But taking a look at what we have right now for altcoins, first off, let's look at Bitcoin dominance. Bitcoin dominance topped out around 66%. Are we potentially making lower highs as Bitcoin dominance is, topping out? That is one possibility that we see. That is also a very interesting correlation to when the Fed is ending quantitative tightening. Because if we take a look at the last time the Fed ended quantitative tightening, which was actually in September of 2026, it correlated with Bitcoin dominance topping out around 72%. And following that, we had, a nice drop on Bitcoin dominance over the next few months. We had a drop of 20% on Bitcoin dominance, but then we have an outlier of Bitcoin dominance coming back to about 73, 74%. So that is something to watch here. But in the macro sense of things, quantitative tightening ending did top Bitcoin dominance for the time being. And as we know right now, we could be potentially making lower highs on Bitcoin dominance, which is a good thing for your altcoins. Now, if we take a look at another chart, which is also showing us that QT is bullish for altcoins, last time we saw the end of quantitative tightening, we saw the pairs of altcoins versus Bitcoin bottom out again in September of 2019. Now, fast forward to where we are right now, we are seeing that quantitative tightening is just a few days away. December 1st is happening. Is this going to be the bottom for alts versus Bitcoin? We are going to wait and see what that means. But if history were to repeat itself, we could potentially have a similar bottom that we saw when the Fed ended quantitative tightening back in 2019. Then you have your outlier of the, COVID-19 pandemic. But ultimately speaking, watch for that relationship to play out in the next few days and weeks to come. Now, if you take a look at ETH versus Bitcoin, we've been monitoring this because ETH versus Bitcoin did bottom in April, which coincided perfectly with the 2019 lows. And since that point on, even though it's been very slow over the last few weeks, we've seen ETH Bitcoin continue to make higher lows as we've continued on in this market. So a low in April, a low in May/June, another low in August. We had, a nice peak in the middle parts of August when ETH was making new all-time highs. And ever since then, ETH has been bleeding against Bitcoin for the better part of the last 3 months. And we're finally back in, a range. We're finding some support at previous levels and potentially seeing that ETH versus Bitcoin is going to go back up as Bitcoin dominance comes back down and as liquidity makes its way back into the crypto markets. So those are some of my thoughts for December. I'm super excited to see what happens with quantitative tightening and if the interest rates continuing to go lower. I do still think we have a little ways to get out of this hole for Bitcoin. I do think that it's going back to the 50-week moving average, which right now sits at around $102,000. So that's going to be my next target. Then we're going to reassess and see what the markets wants to do at that point. But with that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, smash the like button, subscribe to the channel, check out the Discord if you want to stay up to date with the crypto space and you want to see what I am doing. That's the spot to be. And with that being said, I'll catch you guys in my next video. Peace.